Let's use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply framework to look at a case where we might think it's like Europe is today, where we're at an equilibrium where GDP is far below potential and where we have very low inflation at 1%. Europe now is veering towards 0% or even deflation. So this is the situation Europe finds itself in. Now, normally the process of recovery from a recession like that would be that because inflation is low and because the output gap is quite significant and is negative, there's a lot of unemployment, so expectations of inflation go down even further, and the aggregate supply curve shifts as inflation goes down. The central bank is able to lower real interest rates more. Real interest rates stimulate aggregate demand, investment, net exports, and consumption expenditures, and the economy gradually returns to its potential level at a very low level of interest, but that's the recovery process, so we think of that as the recovery process that happens normally. That process, when inflation is 1% and real interest rates are already extremely low, so nominal interest rates are very low in Europe, maybe 0%, so that real interest rates are actually negative. So that recovery might take a long time to happen. So we might think about other options where we have policies, government spending policies or monetary policies that will hasten the return to potential. So we want to talk about some of those considerations precisely because the normal process of recovery will take a long time. So second thing we might think about is why not increase government spending? Why not increase government programs to provide jobs directly? The problem is there's a lot of unemployment, and so why not have the government directly employ people through construction projects, through projects like reducing class size and hiring a lot more teachers, all those kinds of government projects, provisions of public goods that might be possible. Well, one problem is that for Europe at least, the European Union has rules that prohibit the government from having a government budget deficit of greater than 3%. So that's the cap for government budget deficit. So this increased government spending happening through borrowing, then the government budget deficit goes up unless GDP rises right away. Then that would violate those rules. So that's one constraint. Another constraint might be that there might be political leaders who think that this might be inflationary, especially if the government projects are not actually very productive. Then, in some sense, by borrowing and putting all these people back to work when they're not actually very productive, the total amount of goods and services produced in society doesn't go up, and that then might lead to greater inflation. It'd be like a price shock. And we can't exactly model that in our model, but it seems reasonable to think that might be a process going on. So government expansionary fiscal policy doesn't only have to happen through increasing government spending, it can also happen through decrease in taxes. Why not just give a rebate to households and they'll go out and spend more, and that will stimulate a recovery. So shifting the aggregate demand curve over to the right. And that's certainly feasible. A lot of times political parties don't agree on the right mix of fiscal policy and whether it should be changing government spending, changing taxes, what the right proportion is. There's also room to be skeptical that in a downturn like Europe is in, just how high the marginal propensity to consume is. So if taxes go down, but people perceive that it's tough times ahead, then they might save a lot of the decrease in taxes. The economy then might be even worse off than if they had decreased, than if they hadn't done that, because with the decline in taxes, because of the budget conditions, the government might also decrease its spending. So now you've seen government spending, which before had a high multiplier in the sense that when the government spends money, it spends all of the money. If it gives that money back to taxpayers, they might only spend, out of that tax rebate, they might only spend 50% or 40% of it. And so the multiplier from that effect might be very low. And so that might be a really bad policy in this type of situation. There's another issue that comes up, which is that these fiscal policies lead to increases in government budget deficit, and we might imagine that bond traders, holders of large stocks of government bonds, might decide that the risk of government default is increased because of this increase in the deficit, and so they might start demanding a much higher premium in the interest rate. And we think of that as this F value, so financial frictions, or the risk default premium goes up, and so investment actually ends up going down, real investment in buildings, because the risk premium on credit has gone up in the economy. So that's another consideration that we might think of that makes fiscal policy not be quite so attractive. Fiscal policy and monetary policy also might not be attractive because some economists might argue that potential GDP itself has declined. So you might recall that our premise of all of this story was that GDP was below potential, but what if potential itself moved over and declined because the recession itself generated a kind of de-skilling, or maybe one of the underlying reasons for the recession was technological change or trade patterns, changing globalization trade patterns, were leading the economy simply to be less productive than it was before. And if that's the case, then these expansionary policies will be inflationary rather than increasing GDP over the long run, because potential now is right here, and so any policies, as we've seen in our standard ADAS curve, policies that then generate GDP above potential would simply loop back through the inflationary mechanism. The economy would go back to potential. So that's another important consideration when thinking about expansionary policies. Finally, we should ask, in the transition to our zero lower bound, is whether there's room for the central bank to pursue expansionary monetary policy when the interest rate's already 0%. And there it's important to remember that the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus inflation. If inflation is negative, then the real interest rate is going to be positive and significant when we're at the zero lower bound, when I is equal to 0. Expansionary monetary policy might slow down the rate of deflation, and that paradoxically then might make the real interest rate higher rather than lower. So there's a real danger that the expansionary monetary policy simply can't change the this zero lower bound criteria, and so we end up having we'll be talking about the zero lower bound more, but we can't actually use monetary policy to stimulate aggregate demand.